had no regard for that person's life or anybody else's life. All I was concerned with was making as much money as I could. If you're using other people's money, then actually you can grow quickly. Yeah. And it got to the stage where in 2007, it was turning over about 70 million pounds. And so the plan was that in 2008, I was going to achieve my goal to be in the Times Rich list. And obviously what happened was the mortgage market collapsed.
Welcome, everybody. This is Simon Gilbo with Inspired. I'm really excited this week. We've got another fantastic guest. If you're new to us, I am sick to death of being bombarded relentlessly in the 24/7 news cycle by negativity and depressing stories. You know, if you watch the news too much, you are letting someone else just basically curate for you all the bad stuff going on in the world that just make you more anxious and cynical. And so we're just coming against that really in a complete opposite spirit of introducing you to mates of mine from all sorts of different journeys and life experiences who've seen God at work powerfully in them. So that in an hour's time, under an hour probably, you will leave encouraged in your faith, stirred to keep going strong. And this week, I've got no doubt you're going to be encouraged because we've got with us Manoj Raithatha. How are you doing, Manoj?
I'm really well. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. So we go back, I'm guessing it's about 14 years. We were both speaking. It was at Soul Survivor Watford. It was Norjavan, which is an Asian youth movement event. And that's when I first came across you. You had just come out, I think, with the book Filthy Rich, How the Property Crash Saved My Life, in which you tell the story of how you made shed loads of money and then 2008 was a nightmare, wasn't it? But although it was a nightmare, it led to the beautiful transformation in your life. Listen, I don't want to tell your own story for you. So over to you. Just tell us, in terms of background, obviously Manoj Raithatha, that's an Asian name. Give us your background.
Yeah, so my family are South Asian. If I think back to my grandparents, they were born in India. And they were part of the economic migrants that went to East Africa. They went to Nairobi. They set up businesses there. Some of my family ended up in Uganda. Well, we all know what happened in 1972 when Idi Amin expelled all the Asians, South Asians from Uganda. And so that's how my family ended up in the UK. And so I was born in the UK. I'm a twin. I've got a twin sister. She's a consultant doctor. In fact, I've got a brother and sister who are twins as well. So there's two sets of twins in the family. And I was born in Watford.
And I picture, I mean, I've got lots of Asian friends, both from the UK context and when we were in Burundi. And I picture that scene as, you know, incredibly close-knit families, incredibly hardworking. Was that you?
Oh, absolutely. Definitely very, very close-knit. When I lived out in Kenya for a while, I remember it was my brother and sister's birthday, and literally family and friends descended on our house, and we must have been putting up about 30 members of the family. Yes, and hardworking as well. There's always that kind of work ethic in the home. I suppose it's modeled into us, so we look at the way that our parents work and we kind of follow suit.
Yeah, and it's funny because I've also met, having sort of praised the Indian connections I've had, I've also met some hard-nosed, arrogant businessmen that drove the hardest bargain and treated people around them so badly. Now, knowing your story, I'm guessing that was what you became, wasn't it, before you had your encounter with Jesus?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I was definitely that person for a number of years. And it was challenging not only for the people that I was doing business with, but I think also for my family to witness how arrogant and ruthless I'd become. And particularly my wife, who did tell me after I became a Christian that she was very close to leaving me. And that would have been one of the reasons why.
Yeah. So, okay, I mean, any key teenage year incidents, or as we move through, you went to university, tell us about that.
In terms of my schooling, I ended up moving to Kenya, to Nairobi. We moved out there for economic reasons. My father had been made redundant and moved out there. And interestingly, despite the fact that we were raised Hindu in Watford and went regularly to the temple, actually it was a temple that was gifted by George Harrison, member of the Beatles, the Hare Krishna temple. And we ended up in Nairobi, and we were enrolled in a Christian-run school there. And it might sound a bit strange, why would our parents actually do anything like that when we were actually raised as Hindus? But they weren't really expecting me to take any kind of interest in Christianity. But in the end, I did start to think, could there possibly be something in this story of God, the creator, dying for the created? I suppose that it was that element in the Christian story that did really resonate with me when I was in that school.
So in terms of chronology, you then moved back to England for university?
Yes, I did. And the reason that came about was because we'd moved out to Kenya for economic reasons, but things didn't work out for my father in the family business. And so, we moved back. I ended up in Portsmouth, but I'd come with these sort of dreams and aspirations to ultimately make it rich, because I was fed all these tales in Kenya of my grandfather's rise to riches, and I wanted to be audacious. I wanted to be a risk taker, and I really wanted to flaunt my wealth because that's what he did. And so I thought, well, look, this is a great chance. I'm here in the UK, do my A-levels, work hard, and go and do a business degree or an economics degree. But it didn't really work out that way.
So you studied English?
I studied English, yes. And the reason was that I was fascinated by this English teacher, and he was encouraging me to pursue passionately what I enjoyed in life. So it was a different way of thinking, because up until that point in my life, it was all about money. And it was thinking about how I could actually get to that point. But he made me think about other areas of my life. And it just so happened that I did like English. Not enough to go and study it, but I didn't do well in my economics A-levels. So I ended up in the clearing system, and I ended up studying English at degree level at university. Bangor University is where I went.
All right, in Wales. So any key incidents at Bangor?
At Bangor University, I think what was interesting was that when I arrived, there was somebody that spoke to me and said, do you want to go to church? And I thought, this is really strange. I've just arrived at university. And I'd kind of turned my back on this idea of Christianity whilst I'd been fascinated as a child by it. As I grew older, I thought to myself, well, it's not really for me. What does faith have to do with living in the real world where I'm trying to make ends meet, so to speak. But anyway, there I was at university, and I thought, well, look, it's the first week. I don't want to sound rude. So I went to this evangelical church, and all I can say, Simon, is that it just seemed utterly, utterly bizarre. It made no sense at all, because when I used to go to the temple, there were all these statues of gods. So you kind of knew who you were worshipping. But in this evangelical church, this Christian church, there was nobody there. And there was all these people going crazy, clapping their hands and putting their hands in the air and looking utterly elated. And I thought to myself, why? It made no sense at all. And I suppose after I left the church, I made a sort of decision that I have no plans to go back again, because it just kind of all seemed a little bit strange and weird.
So you end up going into property whilst being a teacher, don't you?
The reason that I ended up going into property whilst being a teacher was because I needed to find some way to get out of my career. It wasn't the plan to become an English teacher, but what happened was I met this girl at university. She wanted to be a teacher, and so I kind of followed her into the profession. But then she split up with me, and that absolutely cut me up because I'd even bought her the ring. So I thought, this is the one, I'm going to get married to her. And as I kind of came through what I'd say is a bit of depression, I thought to myself, when I was in Kenya, the quote that I was told about was fortune favors the brave. In fact, that was a school motto. And so I thought, I've got to start taking some risks in life. I'm not made to be a teacher all of my life. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with teaching, but it just wasn't for me.
So amidst your many talents, you're a writer as well. So tell us a bit about that.
I had a short stint in writing, and the way that came about was when I was in teaching English, I thought to myself, I'm not really very good at this. All this marking that I've got to do, And one day, the head of English turned up in my classroom and looked at the whiteboard, and he said, "Manoj, you spelt separate wrong." And I thought, have I? I'm sure that's the right way to spell it. And he said, "No, that's the wrong way to spell it." So I wasn't really cut out for being an English teacher, even though I'd done an English degree. So I thought, well, look, what if I shift into drama teaching? And I was able to do that quite easily because there's a drama department. They needed more support. And then I thought to myself, well, look, I like taking risks. So why don't I do a bit of, studying in drama on the side, do a part-time, well, actually it was full-time master's course, but they only required me to go in sort of 1 day a week, still be involved in teaching, and hopefully one day I'll end up in business anyway. But anyway, I did this drama master's, and the final component of this degree was that I had to direct this play. And I met a girl at the time, and we started dating. And I said, would you help me to write this piece? Maybe this British Asian kind of comedy drama about this group of kids growing up, caught between sort of West and Eastern traditions. Mm-hmm. And she said, yeah, absolutely. So I wrote this play with her, put it on at university. But the actors I had to get from outside the university because there weren't many Asian people in the university. So the way I persuaded them to act, and some of them were fresh out of drama school, was that, look, if you perform in this university production, I'll take it up to Edinburgh Festival and I'll pay for it all. And I'd saved up some money anyway to afford all of that. So that's what I did. Took it up to Edinburgh Festival. It's called BBA and Proud, which stands for British Born Asian and Proud. And most days there was probably 5 or 10 people coming to watch it. It was just one of the thousands of productions at the Edinburgh Festival. But the last week, somebody important came in, and before I knew it, it had been awarded a Fringe First Award. And only a small number of those awards are handed out. And the next day, the place was packed. We were just, it was a production in a church. That's what it was. It wasn't even in a theatre in Edinburgh, but it was packed. We toured that play sort of nationally. And on the back of it, somebody came and watched it, liked it so much that they introduced us to a TV production company. They invited us to write this TV series called My Life as a Puppet, about a crazy Asian family. So we wrote that, and it aired on CITV. And before we knew it, it got nominated for so many awards. It won a BAFTA award. Wow. It was nominated for an international Emmy as well. So I flew out to America. It didn't win the award, but in fact, it was interesting actually at the awards ceremony. I remember standing at the back and thinking to myself, I've had this time in teaching. I've done this writing and it's been good fun. I've really enjoyed it. But I'm not really bothered if we win the Emmy or not. Really, what I want to do is make money. And that's when I really made the decision. I'm just going to focus on getting into business and making money through that. And that's it. I've never really done any kind of writing other than my autobiography. That's about it, really. I thought to myself, when I was in Kenya, I was told about... the quote that I was told about was "Fortune favors the brave." In fact, that was a school motto. And so I thought, I've got to start taking some risks in life. I'm not made to be a teacher all of my life. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with teaching, but it just wasn't for me. So I did some research, and I looked at this one street in Wandsworth. And I thought to myself, I'm sure at some point, yuppies are going to start moving in and chopping up these houses into flats. It was a stone's throw from East Putney, where you could buy a flat for about 110,000. But here I could buy a whole house. And so I managed to get some money together from my parents, who were able to help me out a bit. And some of the money came from selling furniture. And if I could just tell you a quick story about selling furniture, because it was really, really intrinsic to how I became a salesman. When I started selling furniture, and it was just a summer job in between sort of finishing university and starting teacher training, I ended up with this job to serve coffee, and it was Dowie Egbert coffee. And they said to me, look, all you've got to do for the next 2 weeks is serve coffee. We're having this big promotion. We're selling loads of sofas. Just serve coffee. And I found out just the psychology, I suppose, of selling furniture, that if they drink coffee and the smell of coffee, they'll sit on the sofa, they'll ask you a few questions, and they'll sign on the dotted line. Now, I wasn't a salesman, so I was passing on the leads to other people. But the area manager realized that I was quite good at speaking to the customers, offered me a job. And literally within a few months, I was a top salesman across something like 30 branches. Wow. And all I was doing was I kept on serving coffee. The other salespeople didn't. And I decided not to speak to them about the product. Actually, don't talk about the product. Talk about anything else. Talk about football, make them feel relaxed, sit on the sofa, drink coffee, and then they start asking me questions. And because they feel so comfortable, they end up buying the furniture. But I'm sharing this story with you because I actually made a huge amount of money from selling furniture and going to the Ideal Home exhibition. Enough to combine it with my parents' contribution and to buy this house in Wandsworth. Now, this house in Wandsworth, nobody wanted to live on that road. It was like that, Simon. This house had been on the market possibly 2 years. But I was just trying to work out what was going on with the market. I took a punt, and within a couple of years, the house had more than doubled in price, and I found myself selling it for a profit. And then I thought to myself, you know what? I think I've got an eye for this, for this kind of business. What if I now use all this money that I've made? And I can't remember exactly how much it was, but probably £150,000, which, as you can imagine, I've been in teaching for a couple of years and earned £150,000 on the side. It's like a colossal amount of money. So I invested almost all of that into buy-to-let properties. And so what I do is I do some research, try and buy a property that was near a train station, that had good rental kind of capacity, something that didn't need too much work, and built up a portfolio. Before I knew it, I think I had something like 15 properties, and that was within a year or so. And then as the market kept on going up, I kept on remortgaging, refinancing, pulling out some more money and then reinvesting it. And the business started to grow from then on.
And then you bought 100 houses straight from the developer and were flipping those?
It sounds strange. One would have thought, Manoj, you've got this portfolio of properties. You didn't want a life in teaching. You're now a businessman. You're doing what you want. You've got a nice house now. You're driving a nice car. Surely you would be satisfied. But it felt to me like going up a mountain to see a view, and you're looking out and you're expecting to see something stunning, and it isn't there. So you come back down the mountain, you want to go up a higher mountain. And it's a bit like that for me in business. I was really addicted to it, to the point that I'd be counting in my sleep, literally, how much money I'd made. So I thought, well, look, I'm going to take some serious risks now. And so this is what happened, Simon. I went to the property show in London one year, and I found out about buying off-plan properties, as in I'd buy a property from plan, from a builder. And what would happen is that I'd put down a deposit, I'd exchange contracts, and in a couple of years, I'd complete on the transaction. It would be ready, a brand new property for me to rent out. And hopefully the price has gone up during that period. But I thought to myself, what if I was to persuade a builder to give me, let's say, 20, 30, 40 properties in one go? That way I could monopolize on having a particular type of an apartment in that block. And then I would try and sell on those contracts very, very quickly. Now, it was a high-risk strategy because I would need to find all these buyers to exchange contracts with me on the day that I'd exchange with the builder. But we tried it out, actually, with some apartments up north that were cheaper. It was very, very stressful because I had to find all these buyers within a space of about 6 weeks. And so the way it works, Simon, is that on the day that I'm exchanging contracts with the builder, all these buyers of mine are with another solicitor exchanging contracts with me. So the money is being passed down the chain. And I'm sharing this with you because actually we didn't really have the money to exchange on this kind of quantity of property. But because it worked the first time, I thought, well, let me try something bigger. And it got to the point where on one occasion, I spoke to a builder up in Leeds. The value of the block was 33 million, something in that range. And I said to him, I want to buy them all. And he didn't know anything about me. I didn't really have a track record. But he didn't do any kind of due diligence. The question he asked was, are you happy to buy this block at 33 million? And can you put a reservation down on all the apartments? And I said, I can do that straight away. And the money was literally in their account, probably the day after. And the agents kind of negotiated it. And he must have thought to himself, well, if he can't perform, he's going to lose that 200,000 pounds. And he said, well, you've got a couple of months to now exchange contracts on this block. So I had to find £1.5 million, which I didn't have. And so I spent literally the next sort of 2 months trying to sell these apartments, doing a lot of networking. And that's where my sort of furniture selling sort of came in handy, the whole kind of psychology. How can you encourage people to buy apartments from you? And so that's what I did. I sort of put that into practice, and I would be visiting people in their homes and trying to run little seminars to get people together and talk to them about property. But within a couple of months, I'd managed to find buyers for almost all the apartments. And I was able to exchange contracts on it using their money.
Wow.
And that's really how the business grew. I mean, it was an exponential growth. And it clearly would be, Simon, if you're not putting in your own money, then that's what you could do. If you're using other people's money, then actually you can grow quickly.
Yeah.
And it got to the stage where really, I suppose in 2007, it was turning over about 70 million pounds.
Wow. And as your wife testified, you just become a really quite unpleasant person.
I became a really, really unpleasant character. It's difficult to, even for me now, to look back and to think, seriously, Manoj, is that the kind of person you were? I had absolutely no regard for people. I remember persuading one guy to buy a number of properties from me. And I persuaded him. And as a result of it, well, it didn't work out for him. And he had a bit of a breakdown. And his wife was so upset with me. She said, why did you get him to, really, really stretch himself? But I had no regard for that person's life or anybody else's life. All I was concerned with was making as much money as I could. And so whilst I could afford a lavish lifestyle, I could take my wife and children to Dubai and Mauritius and send my children to private school and things like that. My wife was getting increasingly upset in the home. She said I was very ruthless in the way that I spoke. I wasn't sensitive to her feelings. She didn't really want the money anyway. She just wanted a loving home where I would...
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think it really hit home to me one day when I was watching a film with my children, Simon, and they were really, really excited about it. I was watching this film, it was some children's film on DVD back then. And it was only years later that I realized why they were so excited, because typically I wouldn't do that. I'd be working all hours.
So things got worse, marriage-wise and family life-wise, with the stresses, and then 2008 came, and most of us can remember what happened in 2008. Tell us what happened to you.
Well, 2008 was going to be the big year for us. We'd built up this business. We had this huge portfolio. I think we had contracted on something like £330 million worth of property. And so the plan was that in 2008, I was going to achieve my goal. And the goal was to be in the Times Rich list. And that's what I wanted. And I knew that I was comfortably going to be in it in 2008 because we had this pipeline of properties that was coming up to completion. But as we know, in 2008, we had the financial crash. And our business was built on the need for mortgage finance. You needed mortgages to complete on the transactions. And obviously what happened in 2008 was the mortgage market collapsed. And so all these lenders, even lenders were going bust. How crazy is that? And so who was going to be lending money in a market like that when property prices were actually going down? And we had all these properties coming up for completion in 2008. So what happened was the builders, they were up against it because the banks wanted the money back. The builders were then starting to sue me. And, after me in the chain were all these investors that I'd sold on to. Well, there's no point in me suing anybody because the situation was that everybody was stuck. The values had dropped. These properties were not worth what we originally bought them for. And not only that, the mortgages were not also there. It was very, very tricky. It probably lasted about two to 3 years to just try and sort out some of the mess through that. But actually, I'll get onto that in a moment, actually how some of that got resolved. Because more importantly, in 2008, while all this was kicking off, my son also became critically ill. Now, we knew the drill, Simon. We'd go to the hospital because he had breathing difficulties as a child, and he'd be given the nebulizer, which is what happened on every occasion, and maybe he'd stay in hospital for 4 or 5 days. They'd sort out his breathing, he'd feel better, and then he'd end up back home again. But on this occasion, my wife called me and she said, "I'm in the ambulance, you better get to the hospital quick." So I just, drove there as quickly as I could. And when I entered the hospital, they were trying to give him the nebulizer and it wasn't working. And so before we knew it, he was rushed into resuscitation. And I don't know where the doctors were on that day, Simon, but there were a couple of nurses. And so I was holding my son, Ishan, rushing after these nurses who are going into resuscitation. And as we get into that room, his airways just shut down. Wow. And so I'm holding my own son. He's 2 years old at the time, and he stops breathing. And before I knew it, suddenly doctors appeared out of nowhere. I mean, the room was packed. I think there must be about 15 people. He was intubated. And in those sort of situations, well, you're ushered out of the room. And what do I find myself doing in that moment is collapsing to my knees in prayer. Now, I felt a fraud doing it. I know I'd been living a very sinful life. So I was a terrible husband. I was a terrible dad. I was a terrible son. I didn't treat people properly at all. I had no regard for anybody. I'm the sort of person that if a pregnant woman, got on the train, I wouldn't have been the one getting up for her. I had no regard for anybody. And the love of money had just made me that kind of personality. But here in this moment, even though I'd heard about the Christian God at this primary school, this creator God that had died for humanity, and been excited about it and interested in it for a while, but turned my back on it in the end. There I was praying. I didn't know who I was praying to, Simon. All I knew was that I was in desperation. And when you're up against it, what else do you do? You collapse to your knees in prayer. And that's what I did.
And any answer?
There was an answer. My son ended up in St. Thomas's for 4 days. He was intubated. He was wired up to all kinds of machinery. I wept for 4 days. And that was really unusual because my wife had never seen me like that. But this was my son. This was my son. This was my flesh and blood. And this was the one that I was going to pass on the business to. I had all these kind of plans for the kind of life that we were going to live as a family. On the 4th day, the consultant said he's not opening his eyes anytime soon. I'm really sorry, but he suffered a huge trauma. We're still trying to figure out what is going on. And yet, at the same time, I was strengthened in some way by the prayers of a Christian couple. Now, this couple had come over from America. The guy was in the Navy. They had a family. They lived close to us, and their daughter went to the same school as ours. And we'd recently got to know them. They invited us around to their house for food, and they were great people. When they found out my son was ill, they said, we're going to be praying, and they got the church to pray. And I was really touched by this because in my upbringing, I never really saw anybody from my sort of Hindu faith community doing something like this. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but I never actually saw it. But here I was witnessing the love of people. Well, of course, you welcome the prayers. And the lady that was praying later told me that she collapsed to her knees and wept for my son. This is what I found out some months later. Anyway, they're praying. The consultants told us, your son's not going to open his eyes anytime soon. An hour later, as the consultant is doing the ward round, she arrives at my son's bed and he just bolts upright in bed.
Wow.
It's like Lazarus. I mean, he was pulling away at the wires, all the tubes. It was like, I don't need this. It was an extraordinary thing to witness. And I said to my wife, amidst all the elation, the tears and the questions, how can this be? Because we were just told, he's going to be in here for a very, very long time. And now he's sitting up in bed as if he's absolutely fine. I said to my wife, we're going to go to church. We're going to thank the couple that prayed for our son. I know my mother was praying. I know my father. I know other people in my family were praying and they're Hindus. But there was something about the prayers of that couple for my son that I knew had healed him.
Hey folks, don't know if you can hear the cicadas in the background. This is me out in Burundi. I'm lying in my bed after an exhausting cycle ride with muscles aching but feeling very satisfied. I'm out with the team doing our 2024 Tour du Burundi. It's our 9th cycling fundraiser out here to raise money for desperate Burundi, going through such a rough time. And yet we're seeing beautiful kingdom stuff happen. So if you wanted to get involved in that, if you're enjoying the podcast, want to help out, please go to greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired. That's greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired if you want to help out in this very precious, needy nation. God bless you. Now let's get back to the podcast.
So you went to church. Was it different from the first banger, sort of disillusioning, weird experience?
Well, for 2 Sundays, I found it not so interesting, if I'm honest, but I'd committed actually to going twice. It was a good church. It was, great church, but it didn't really resonate with me. But I thought, I've got to do this. This is my way of saying thank you. But on the 3rd Sunday, they invited me to another church, this couple. And I decided to go. And I remember being outside the church. And then as I walked in, Simon, I felt something. I can remember it so clearly. Even now, as I'm talking to you, I'm standing outside the church. And as I walk in, I'm hit with the presence of God. That I later came to realize that that's what it was. And I just felt it. So now I was connected in. Now I was interested. And it's not like many people were talking to me about faith over the course of the next 4 or 5 weeks, but I kept on going. Even though my friends were not going, I was going to this church. And nobody was really talking to me, but I was hearing again the message of the gospel. And I'd seen the cross countless times, on necklaces, on churches, but this time it really made sense. And so I decided one day that this God had saved my son. And if this God had saved my son, then this God is worth me giving my life for. And so I gave my life to the Lord. And it was a surrendering of my life. That's the only way I can describe it. I really was saying to the Lord, not in words, so to speak, but I'm yours. And it was such a powerful encounter. I felt like an open heaven. I felt love, the love of God. And when I went out of church that day, my wife later said to me that she didn't recognize me. It was like sort of 90%. She used 90%. She said 90% of your personality has really, really changed. And I really had changed because I don't think anybody recognized me. My mother thought I joined a cult because now all I wanted to do was to live for Jesus when I'd been running this business with my mother. We were in business together. So she saw me in business, and now she's seeing this guy that wants to serve Jesus. I went around saying sorry to so many people that I'd hurt. I remember giving some money back to one person because I'd shortchanged them their commission, and they thought, "What's going on with this guy?" Things like that happened, and everything was in color. It felt like so many years I'd been living in black and white, but now I could see things more brightly.
Beautiful.
And here I am.
Yeah. So was it night and day? I mean, a dramatic overnight? I mean, sanctification, obviously, the process of growing holy, that's a lifetime's journey, isn't it? But it was pretty stark for you, the new Manoj.
It was like Paul on the road to Damascus. I had encountered the love of God, and to such a degree that I just wanted to give my life fully to him. Because in those early days of my Christian life, it's almost like I heard the Lord speaking to me and saying to me, "Manoj, my son died on the cross for you, but I want you to remember that your son was rescued. My son went to the cross, he was nailed to it, but I intervened to save your son." And so when I look at Christ, I'm reminded of what God has done, for my son. Yeah. And that obviously was so impactful. I found myself weeping for months, literally months, going to church, and Rio, my wife, wondering, what's going on with him? He's crying again. This is a guy that never cried about anything, didn't care about anybody. So it was a really, really unusual time. And since then, I've sought, by the grace of God, just to serve him and try and be obedient. It's not always been easy, but I've tried to the best to just do what I think the Lord might be telling me.
I'm entrepreneurial, and I have had a few opportunities where I've thought in life, I could pursue this and end up very wealthy. And there's nothing wrong with wealth, but for me, I'm glad that the Lord took me out of that temptation. We really do value and encourage people to be Christians in business. That's a really important role. But you've got to have a solid makeup, haven't you? So it's not money is the root of all evil. The love of money is the root of all evil. And I thank the Lord that he's taken my entrepreneurialism and used it in a different way, if you see what I mean. Now, for you, did you see that the Lord was taking you away from that? But you're still an entrepreneur. You still got that risk-taking spirit, haven't you?
Well, I'm still a businessman. And what happened is after I became a Christian, I wanted to turn my back on business. I thought business is bad. But then I found myself getting to know this vicar in the Church of England. She was a business chaplain. And I didn't realize, but she was meeting up with me regularly and she was mentoring me. And what she was teaching me was that business is good. It can be used to advance the gospel. And she was an incredible woman. Whenever she sort of paused and almost looked up, it was like she was hearing something from God. I mean, a most extraordinary woman. And she then said to me one day, she said, "Manoj, I think that the Lord is saying that we're meant to start a publishing house, a Christian publishing house." Now, back then, I was still trying to battle with saving my property company. This was the crash. I didn't have time to be setting up a new business. I was trying to save the other business. But after a month, we were sitting in a cafe, and I'd already said I'm not interested. But as I was sitting in the cafe, all I can say is that the Holy Spirit convicted me in that moment. And I said to this friend of mine, her name was Bridget, because she sadly passed away. And I said to Bridget, "You're right." And she said, "Well, you don't need to do it, Manoj, if you don't want to." And my answer to her was, "I don't get a choice. I don't get a choice in these things. I can't turn around to God and say, I'm not going to do something if the Lord has clearly said that we've got to do it." So I said, but the proof that God is in it will come if, all these books start coming in. And literally overnight, we set up this business by name. It's called Instant Apostle. We set up a website. We didn't really have much expertise, but literally all the help that we needed came. A copy editor came, a proofreader came, a cover designer came, and books came. and actually the first book that we published was a book by somebody called Sean Lambert, A Study in Christian Mindfulness. Right. He was a Baptist minister, And that book went on to sell thousands of copies. Still to this date, our highest selling book. Most of our books don't sell huge quantities, but it was almost like God's favor was on it.
Yeah.
We only put in a couple of £1,000s to set it up. And here it is today. We've never had to put in any more money. But just a story about how challenging it was to set up the business, because on the day of the launch, Bridget Adams had to be taken in for the launch on a mobility scooter. So from setting up the business by name and launching it about 4 or 5 months later, the cancer she had come back. But they got her there on a mobility scooter. And that was the last day that I ever saw her. She passed shortly after that. But I actually arrived at the publishing house launch late as well. And what had happened that morning was that my son had become really, really seriously ill with his breathing difficulties, a bit like he'd had back in 2008. But we were now in 2012. And it was so bad that I thought, let me sleep with him. And about 5 o'clock in the morning, I heard this faint ringing of the phone. Now, if you can imagine, I'm in bed with my son. He's been given the pump, and I thought, well, look, hopefully he's going to get through. We'll take him to the doctor in the morning. He's wrapped around me, my son. My arms are wrapped around him. The phone is on the other side of the bed. I hear this faint ringing, and I go and look at the phone, and it says doctor on the phone. And it's as if I had called out. It wasn't as if somebody was calling in. And when I looked at my son, I could see that his breathing was becoming really labored. I must have left the house in a minute. There was no time to wait for an ambulance. And as I get into the hospital, I could see that his airways were shutting down. And as I got into A&E, they moved very quickly. He was given 3 rounds of the nebulizer, and he did respond. Wow. But if the phone hadn't rung, I'd say 10 minutes later, he would have probably been, it would have been too late. Yeah. And that was the day of the launch. And I suppose I'm sharing that also because throughout my life, the more that we've tried to do things very boldly for the Lord. I mean, Instant Apostle was a real bold act. It's a Christian publishing house where you're publishing books of people meeting Jesus. They're books to strengthen Christians in the faith. And they can go anywhere, can't they? They can go far and wide. Books get passed around by person to person. And I suppose that day I realized the significance of what we were getting involved in. And my wife did tell me later on, she said, you have to go to the launch. Even if you end up there right at the end, just something about the Lord's told you to do something, you've got to press on. Yeah. The son is fine. Just go. And I did go. And I'm glad I did because it's the last time I saw Bridget as well.
Wow. And so now, buddy, you're a Baptist minister. I mean, how did that come about?
Simon, I always wanted to be a minister. So when I first became a Christian in 2008, I spoke to one of the pastors in the church and I said, I feel this calling. I'm ready to give up everything, the business and everything. And over the course of the next 2 years, we did explore ordination in the Church of England. I saw a director of ordinands. I went to the final conference and they turned me down. And I was gutted, Simon. I was so upset. So many questions that I asked God. I said, I was willing to do this, give up everything. But God kept me in business. I started to work at the Evangelical Alliance in the South Asian Forum team, which is helping churches to engage with those of other faith backgrounds.
You're chairman now, are you?
I'm yes, of the board. That's right. Yes, yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And then an opportunity arose in 2017 to preach in a Baptist church. So this church didn't have a minister. And because I was working in the Evangelical Alliance, there was always opportunities to go and speak in other churches. So this was nothing new. It's a great opportunity to bring a message. And I went and I preached the message, and it was on vision. And the church was going through some difficulties. That's one thing I realized when I was there. And there was one person that was deeply upset with me at the end of the service. saying, Manoj, you brought these books into the church to sell. Well, obviously, being a publisher, I always had Christian books with me. And he said, well, you can't do business in the church. I said, we're not doing business. These are books to help you if anybody wants them. Anyway, what happened was I reflected on this on my way back, and I could see that they were without a minister. And as I walked into the house, I said to the Lord, if ever you were to send me into church leadership, I bet you'd send me to a church like this because it needed a lot of love and
TLC. Yep.
That's right, absolutely. Well, what happened was I started to feel the Lord saying to me, Manoj, go and help them. And I was like, well, how can I do that? I'm not a pastor and I'm not a Baptist. But then I spoke to a friend of mine who's a regional minister, and I said, look, I think that God might be saying something. And he said, well, let me pray about it. Must have been a couple of days later, I got on a plane to go abroad with my family, summer holiday. And there was a lady in the row behind me from that church in East London.
No.
And she said to me, you came and preached in our church. Will you come and help us?
Wow.
Well, I got back from my holiday and I spoke to my friend. I said, look, God is certainly saying something in this. He said, why don't I go and speak to the church and see what their plans are? And so he did. And they said to him, we wanted to ask Manoj if he'd come and help us. Now, Simon, it's a really strange thing for a Baptist church to call a lay pastor, it's effectively what I was, with no experience and not being a Baptist.
Yeah.
But I did it for a couple of years. It was quite clearly of the Lord. I think I made lots of mistakes because I lacked the experience. But through the process, I did feel the call to train. And so I did the training and ended up at Pinner Baptist Church.
So it's good coming and doing a men's breakfast with you a few months back. And what does the journey look like now for you?
The journey for me is I'm really passionate about small churches. And I think that's quite interesting because for me, business was always having the big business. But now I look at the smaller churches and I get really excited about them. And if the Lord was to tell me, Manoj, I'm going to make you a minister of a church of 2,000, would I do it? Yes. Would I be passionate about doing it? Probably not initially, because if the Lord was to say to me, Manoj, there's a church of 30 and I want you to move there, then I'd say to myself, yes, I'm really excited about this. I don't know why. I think there's life in small churches. There's lots of small churches in the Baptist denomination. And both churches I've been involved in, the one in East London and Pinner Baptist Church, were relatively small. And it was all around thinking with a business head on, I suppose. You know, how can you bring health, healthy culture? Healthy things grow, don't they? And also, I think in small churches, there's also the opportunity of raising up people. If you've got a church of 80, 90 people, you know everybody, don't you? You get to find out people's gifts. And I love more than anything else in seeing people raised up and serving God. And I think the more we do that as ministers, well, the church is built up, isn't it? Because you're raising up people. And hopefully some of those people will end up leaving the church one day and become ministers or worship leaders or run organizations. I'm really committed to raising 10 pastors. That's what I'd like to do. That's just a personal kind of desire of mine. And I hope that one day I'll get to see that, you know, raising up people to lead other churches.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what I'm really excited about, small churches. And I want to get involved in the small churches across London, particularly in the Baptist denomination, if the Lord would open that door for me.
So you're a small church, but you've actually felt the Lord speak to you clearly recently, didn't you?
Yes, I mean, we are not a large church. There's probably 80 to 100 people in Pinner Baptist Church at the moment. And I like small communities. And I have been thinking to myself, you know, we've got a capacity of 140. What would happen if we get to 140? Do we actually start another service? Or do we actually plant another church? Well, with all this stuff mulling in my mind, one morning at 5 a.m., I got woken up. And the words that came out of my mouth at 5, this is literally, I'm sleeping and just waking up in the moment was revive. And it was such an unusual experience. I found myself kneeling down and praying. and kind of asking the Lord what this all meant. It was a Sunday morning, and I went into church that day, and I said to the church, I said, the Lord is calling us to a wider work. I'm not quite sure what it is, but there's a wider work that we're being called to. A couple of days later, I was in conversation with somebody from the London Baptist Association about another small church that's very close to us. Lovely church, great community there, very small community, probably about 15 people. And the conversation was, would you like to get involved in this church? Well, to cut a long story short, we're now in this process of this small church merging with us. And it all started with that word revive. And that's why I'm really excited about small churches and what the Lord might do in small churches, particularly across London. London's really on my heart. But the way that the Lord confirmed to me that this was of him, I've got to share this story with you. I ended up outside this small church to pray to God. I said, do you really want us to get involved in this? I've heard that word revive. I've had this conversation about possibly this church might being up for merging with us. I said, Lord, give me one more sign, one more sign. So I know somebody that lives close to that church. And so I said to the Lord, I said, I'm going to walk outside that person's house. And I want to have a conversation with that person without actually knocking on the door. And if that happens, Lord, that's as clear as it can be. So I was walking down a different road at the time. I thought, let me just go for a prayer walk around the church. But in that moment, I suddenly felt, no, go to this house now where you know this person. And so I immediately went. I turned around and walked up there. And as I walked past his house, the person I knew drove into their driveway and came out of the car, and I was able to have a conversation without knocking on their door. So that's exciting. I love it when we expect God to speak to us, don't we? God is real. God is to be experienced. God is to be heard. And I could give you countless examples where we've experienced that as a family.
Yeah. Lord, help us all to hear your voice, to be open and attentive to what you're saying, to keep in step with your spirit, not run ahead, not lag behind. So your book, Filthy Rich, How the Property Crash Saved My Life. What I love about books, having written a few, is I love it when I get messages from people that it's really impacted them, changed their life. Have you got any of those?
I'm not sure if I've got anything relating to changing someone's life. But every now and then I've thought to myself, I've written this book. I don't think it's sold huge numbers of copies. Is it really making any kind of difference at all? But I remember one Catholic father contacting me when I was at the Evangelical Alliance and saying to me, I've read your book. This was the first edition of your book. I'd like you to come out to Northern Ireland. I'm a Catholic father, I have a cathedral over here, and I want you to come and preach the gospel. And I said, are you sure? I'm an evangelical. Do you want me to come and, preach in a Catholic cathedral? Am I even allowed to do that? He said, we've got the novena. I didn't quite know what that was. He said, it's going to be happening. I'm going to fly you out there. Come and stay with us a couple of days. And so I did. And so I ended up in this cathedral. There must be about 1,000 people. And he said, share your testimony. Share Jesus. Share what Jesus has done in your life. And every now and then there are stories. I mean, there's this one person in church that has a daughter. And her daughter was speaking to some friends of hers. Her daughter doesn't come to church. She's studying at the moment. And it was one of her friends that mentioned that she just read my book. And so it's interesting how God is at work behind the scenes. Sometimes you hear the stories and it's great when that happens, but it's great just to know that you've just been faithful, you've written something, and God is using it.
Listen, Manoj, it's been a real pleasure to listen to your story. Have you any parting words you want to share?
I suppose what I'd want to encourage people that are listening is to live for Jesus. I think we're living in a time where God is certainly on the move. We are certainly seeing extraordinary things happen. I think God is awakening some of us from this sort of lukewarm Christianity. I think I've embraced that kind of lukewarm Christianity a lot in my life. And I think that, God is on the move, and there's nothing more fulfilling and enriching in life. And indeed, that is our worship, other than to serve God. And so my encouragement is that if you're on the periphery of the church, or maybe your focus and priorities are on things that are not of God, maybe now is the time to bring yourself back at the center of the church, knowing that in God's kingdom, we've all got an intrinsic part to play.
Yeah, bring it on. Oh, mate, those are good last words to close on. Thanks so much, Manoj, for your time. God bless you, brother.
God bless.
So, folks, another great story, isn't it? God is at work in the big and in the small, and taking hold of our gifts and using us wherever we are available for him. I hope you're inspired. I hope you're encouraged. If you are, please share this podcast with someone else. If you want to give us a great review on Spotify, iTunes, that would be a bonus. I want to thank Adam Thomas Steer for the editing and Mike Sandyman for the mixing. Next week, another fantastic guest with us. In the meantime, go for it. God bless you, and toodaloo.